Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Politics of Nuclear Non-Proliferation podcast. I am Daniele, and together with Mr. Hans Kristensen, I will be talking about the Chinese nuclear arsenal, its recent modernization, and what this means for the strategic relations between the PRC and the US. Before we get right into the interview, though, I will give a short introduction, and a good starting point would be an overview of the Chinese nuclear program. So, the first steps by the PSC, established in 1949 towards a nuclear bomb, were taken already in the 1950s, so quite early in its life. At this time, the PRC went through two events, a war and a crisis, that showed them how important nuclear weapons were becoming in the international scenario. These two events are the Korean War and the First Taiwan Strait crisis. During the Korean War, the invading North lost all of its territorial gains after the US, backed by a UN coalition, joined the conflict in 1951. The DPRK at this point contacts the PRC for military assistance, and China warns the US that were they to cross the 38th parallel, demarcating the borders of the two Koreas before the war, they would have to intervene in support of the DPRK. The international coalition proceeds and enters even Pyongyang, triggering Chinese intervention. The Chinese intervention managed to push back the US forces and forces them to seek an agreement. Talks will stagnate at this point, and in 1952, US President Dwight Eisenhower hints at the authorization of the use of nuclear weapons on the Chinese territory, if an agreement could not be found soon. In fact, President Eisenhower already ordered in 1950 10 nuclear-capable B-29 bombers to the Pacific Fleet in order to deter the PRC from joining the conflict in the first place. And their continued presence made this threat very credible. A few years later, in 1953, the armistice is signed, and this was the first instance of the nuclear blackmail for China. The second instance of the nuclear blackmail was during the first Taiwan Strait crisis between 1954 and 1955, which concerned a series of islands close to the Chinese mainland, but formally under the Republic of China control. So during this crisis, the US Congress adopted the Formosa Resolution, tying closely US and Republic of China relations, and the US also signed the Sino-American Defense Treaty, committing the US security to the ROC security. During this crisis, interestingly, President Eisenhower also stated that nuclear weapons would be interchangeable with conventional ones in the defense of the island of Formosa. So, blackmail was a particularly sensitive matter for China at that time, because the PRC, rather China, more at large, had just gone through the natural humiliations, which would be the unjust treaties with the Western powers at the end of the 19th century and the Japanese invasions during years of the Second World War. And this comes after a long history of centrality in the region. After this, the PRC decides to develop its own nuclear program, initially with the assistance of the USSR and the rest of the communist bloc. This, however, was not meant to last for long. With the Secretariat of Khrushchev at the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, relations between the USSR and the PRC soured further. And finally, in 1960, China abandons the Sino-Soviet Friendship Treaty and decided that the nuclear program would be completely autonomous. To stress the symbolic importance of this native initiative, the PRC codenames its nuclear program the Project 596 from the date June 1959, in which the PRC and USSR put a halt to their cooperation project. In 1964, China detonates successfully its first nuclear device, enshrining the PRC as a de facto nuclear power, and when the PRC will also later join the NPT, China will become also a de jure legitimate nuclear power. The PRC has always had a minimal deterrence stance. What this means is that the size of the arsenal is intended to be as small as it's needed to be to deter external aggression or, more in general, assertive behavior vis-à-vis China. To give an idea of what this means, the size of the nuclear arsenal in 1955 was about 230, while the US and the USSR stocked tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, and France and the UK counted between 350 and 400 each. The small size of the arsenal also gave China a reason not to engage in any arms control initiative, because as we also will later explore in the interview, the reason is that China will engage in nuclear talks and nuclear control talks only when the arsenal of the other nuclear powers, and namely US and Russia, will reach their numbers. And it does also make sense. I mean, that's the smallest arsenal between the 5 nuclear powers, so there is no reason for China to engage in any arms talk. Furthermore, the PRC also adopted since the very beginning non-first strike policy, and of course this means that China will not use nuclear weapons first in a confrontation, not even as a retaliatory strike for a conventional action. And the PRC substantiates this policy with the fact that Chinese warheads, delivery systems, and fuel are stored separately, meaning that the nuclear weapons cannot be fired on warning. So they cannot be fired as readily as weapons from the US and Russia. Recent developments of the Chinese arsenal made some authors question whether the historical posture of the PRC was about to change. China is both building more sealers for its ballistic missiles, while also modernizing the arsenal itself with more newer road mobile and solid fuel-based ICBMs. China is also modernizing the rest of the triad, so gravity bombs, nuclear-capable aircraft, and submarines for submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Other authors, though, argue that this is just a consequence of the US deploying missile defense systems both on the homeland and on the territory of its allies, namely the Republic of Korea and Japan, threatening the effectiveness and the survivability of the Chinese nuclear deterrent. This will be discussed. Today, these changes were mainly the US, who has grown concerned with the rise of the PRC on the global scene. Before the more recent years, in particular with the rise of Xi Jinping as the Secretariat of the CCP, the situation was different. While initially China was seen as a threat to US security, with the Asian allies being the Republic of Korea, Republic of China, Japan, Philippines, India, and Pakistan, acting as a cordon sanitaire, first through SEATO and then with a series of bilateral agreements, with the US even considering preemption under the Kennedy administration. Things will change with the Sino-Soviet split mentioned earlier. This split provided the US with the occasion to further isolate the USSR, and thus began diplomatic relationship with the PRC. While in the 1960s, President Johnson decided to station ballistic missile defense systems in the Pacific, and the PRC followed suit with their own ballistic missile defense research program. In the 1970s, relations improved, with President Nixon visiting for the first time the mainland China after the Second World War, and the US even accept the PRC as representative of for China in the UNSC as part of the US recognition of the Chinese One China policy. The US, although, maintains relations with Taiwan and supplies them with defensive equipment. At the end of the 1980s, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is another occasion of Sino-American rapprochement, and the strategic competition between the US and the PRC quelled. Even though regional developments in the 1990s seemed to go in this direction, with a partial reconciliation of the two Koreas, making Sino-American confrontation less likely, the Gulf War marked the realization of China that the US could potentially neutralize their nuclear arsenal, a worry that in some measure continues today. This worry stems from the fact that the US managed to could disarm actually China through conventional means, as opposed to nuclear ones, which was what China mainly worked to counter. Taiwan represented and still represents a particularly sensitive topic for Sino-American relations. The island was born out of the KMT, the Chinese Nationalist Party, which retreated in 1948, between 1948 and 1949, to the island of Formosa. In fact, the formal name of Taiwan is the Republic of China, which I've mentioned twice earlier. And in the initial phases of the Cold War, it was considered a legitimate government of China by the Western world. And in fact, the Republic of China claims sovereignty over not only mainland China, the territory of what is now the PRC, but also external Mongolia, or which we call just Mongolia, and which was a crown dependency of the Qing dynasty before their deposition in 1911. The PRC, on the other hand, considers the island of Formosa as part of the territory and has long made their goal to bring it under their effective sovereignty. They engaged more than once in saber-rattling, threatening to use force to regain territorial integrity for the PRC. And this threat of violence was performed in various forms, for example, in missile tests in its vicinity, aerial sorties on the ROC airspace, naval drills, etc., etc. The latest instances happened in 2018, 2020, 2021, and in particular last year it happened in early October, around the 10th of October, which is an important day in Chinese history, both for the ROC and the PRC, marking the anniversary of an uprising which would eventually lead to the deposition of the Qing dynasty. And finally, during this episode, some treaties will be mentioned, this treaty being the INF, the ABM, and the NPT. The first two treaties are signed by the US and the USSR. The former restricting deployment of intermediate range nuclear forces, and the latter concerning limitations of anti-ballistic missiles defense systems, hence the two names INF and ABM, intermediate nuclear forces and anti-ballistic missile treaties. They are relevant to the topic at hand in as much as they limit the US behavior in nuclear policy. The NPT, on the other hand, was mentioned earlier in the introduction, and it was more comprehensive. It was signed first in 1968, it entered into force in 1970, and was based on three principles. The first one being that the signatories would not acquire nuclear weapons, so non-proliferation, while those who did before the treaty was stipulated are allowed to keep them. Signatories are allowed to use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, meaning thus scientific research and energy production. And so this is the peaceful use of nuclear energy. And the last pillar of the NPT is disarmament. So the 5 nuclear weapon states would pledge to disarm in the future. And this is the most notorious article, the Article 6 of the treaty, although no precise deadline was set. China did not sign the treaty originally, deeming it unjust, and will access the treaty in 1992, along with France, which was the other nuclear power which did not, the de facto nuclear power who did not sign the NPT. And now we can move on to the interview with Mr. Kristensen.
For those who don't know, Mr. Kristensen is the director of the Nuclear Information Project with the Federation of American Scientists in Washington, D.C. His work focuses most on the current status of nuclear arsenal around the world and the policies behind them. He also is co-authoring the World Nuclear Forces Review in the SRPRI yearbook by Oxford University Press, and he is also co-authoring the Nuclear Yearbook since 2001. So thanks for coming today, Mr. Kristensen.
Thanks for having me.
And let's start with a more general question. So what do you make of the current developments regarding the Chinese nuclear arsenal? Would you say that it simply reflects Chinese strategic and military concerns, or does it have also symbolic notes tied to the Chinese transition to a global superpower?
It's a mix, of course, because the Chinese leadership under President Xi Jinping has clearly articulated that it wants Chinese military forces to be sort of world par level by the middle of this century, and we've seen a number of statements about accelerating the development of strategic forces in recent years. At the same time, of course, the Chinese military and planners also have explicit concerns and issues about their survivability of the existing forces, as well as what they're supposed to do if something happens. So it is a multitude of factors that are driving this development. And of course, on top of it all, the sort of intense and intensifying military competition and possibly also political competition with the United States is also a factor, of course. So, on the issue of survivability of what the Chinese nuclear force is supposed to do, they have, many times expressed concern in the past about the need to upgrade in response to what they perceive are threats against their small force, comparatively small force. And we've seen that both in over the years in the development of road mobile solid fuel ballistic missiles for long range and medium range attacks. And we're now seeing a next chapter of that, it appears, with the construction of a large number of silos in central China. And underpinning those, apart from national prestige and what China wants to be seen as, is of course also a fear that US forces, to some extent also Russia, of course, but Russia is less politically in their face these days, but it was in the past and can change in the future. So yes, it's a mix of those factors.
Okay, so I wanted to tie, because you said that Xi Jinping wanted to have an on-par nuclear force by the middle of the century. And I wanted to ask, do you think that the two centenaries of the PRC have played a role? I mean, would you think that China would still have upgraded their nuclear arsenal to the point they have up to date if they wouldn't be nearing the centenary of the People's Republic of China and the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party?
That's impossible to answer.
Yeah.
Of course, who knows what would have happened if it hadn't been for that.
Yeah, true.
I think, and a question, of course, is also whether the current leadership in China, compared to the previous, has decided to do things in a different way, and I think it's quite clear that it has, both internally, domestically, in terms of control of what's going on and treatment of on human rights issues as well, but certainly on the military aspect, quite clearly a difference. And this is of course not just about nuclear forces. It's also primarily about conventional forces and the role that the Chinese leadership sees China playing, particularly in their sort of near areas of Chinese territory, but that's stretching far into the waters of China, of course, as well as the China's ability to sustain its economic interest around the world. We might, of course, see in the future that will be more emphasis on protecting sort of transportation of mineral and oil and what have you from other parts of the world. So just monetary goods in general. So all these issues, I have yet to see anybody saying that this is why China is doing it, like one issue.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It's a multitude of factors.
And keeping with China, if I remember correctly, currently the Chinese arsenal is not ready to fire on warning, right? So if I remember correctly, it stores warheads, delivery vehicles, and fuel separately. So based on that, can it be said that the Chinese nuclear arsenal has more use to the PRC as a political weapon rather than an actual weapon?
Yeah, that's I think for all nuclear weapon states, that's the sort of big, fluffy, elastic issue, because of course, all countries that have nuclear weapons insist they have them for defensive purpose and they're not threatening anyone. We hear that all the time, and all countries, whether they have 200, 2,000, or 20,000, say that what they have is just the minimal needed for deterrence. I mean, that's always the language being used. For the Chinese, it's definitely a political investment, both in terms of protecting the state, and of course also the ability of the regime to demonstrate that it's taking steps against foreign adversaries. But it's also driven by very pragmatic military considerations. It's quite clear that the decision to go first prioritizing road mobile missiles and those with solid fuel was quite clearly a consideration about making sure that more ICBMs would survive a surprise attack. I mean, they very early on concluded that their 20 or so silos with the liquid fuel DF-5 ballistic missile would not survive. Correctly so. And so they tried to overcome some of that. First with the road mobile ICBMs with solid fuel, then more of them, then multiple warheads on some ICBMs. You're correct that the assumption is that China stores most of its nuclear arsenal, nuclear weapons separate from the launchers. That's been a policy for as long as China's had nuclear weapons. But we're hearing rumors these days that there is a development underway by which they seem to increase the operational readiness of a portion of the force. Obviously, they're working on the overall readiness for the force, what it will be able to do in a real crisis, but also in peacetime, that there's a small portion of the force that is brought up to full readiness. It's a little unclear yet whether that means that they actually have nuclear warheads attached to them. Of course, we've not heard anything from the Chinese about this, but we've also not heard Western intelligence sources being very specific about exactly what this means. But there is also, of course, this idea that China is moving toward a launch and warning posture, whereby it would be able to launch its nuclear missiles, not just after nuclear warheads has exploded on the ground, but when it sees an incoming attack. But that requires, of course, development of advanced warning, an advanced warning system, primarily, of course, with space-based infrared sensors. We know that China, over the last 3 years or so, have conducted a number of exercises with its ICBMs, in which they exercised using one satellite with infrared capabilities to train for that type of scenario. And there will be more infrared satellites going up in the years ahead. And so to that extent, you could say, it looks like China is in a way trying to mimic what the United States and Russia are doing and have been doing for decades with their nuclear forces, being able to, operate them in a way where they can't be surprised and taken out by an adversarial attack. So seen from China, this all makes sense. This is about protecting your national assets against the aggression from abroad, and seen from outside, it's played up as if China is now becoming more aggressive and more dangerous, and therefore we have to respond to it as well. So this is this dangerous dynamic that we're in right now, both with China, but for that matter also with Russia.
Okay, so since you talked about Russia and the US and the relation, I want to move to the relations between China and the US. So authors like Flora Cunningham argue that a big part of the problem in the relations between China and the US, at least on the strategic field, is the fact that the US doesn't want to acknowledge a situation of mutual vulnerability. And so what I want to ask is, an admission, even not explicit, of vulnerability from the US, would you think that it could actually improve the relations, or would it just embolden China and make it behave more aggressively?
Strategic vulnerability is already a fact. I mean, we don't have to admit it or acknowledge it. And I think both sides know that it's a fact. They have political reasons for why they want the other to move on the issue or insist that they don't want to move on the issues. But there is strategic vulnerability. I mean, the Chinese, they have extraordinary military capabilities at the nuclear level that could cause, enormous destruction in the United States. So there's no way that the United States can knock it out preemptively. There is mutual vulnerability. So I think it's like, but the issue is more about, I think, trying to regulate how this nuclear and strategic relationship evolves. And, of course, if you get too entangled in the dynamics that we know so well from the Cold War, this sort of comparing of forces and both force levels, but also specific capabilities, and worst case scenarios, and all this kind of stuff that drove the Cold War, then we will have a Cold War with China, of course. So I think it behooves anyone who's involved in policymaking and shaping the relationship to try to sort of cool those sentiments and calm those directions and issues. It's a tough balancing act, of course, because at the same time, both countries have legitimate national security concerns and they want to protect those. So it is a balancing act. It's impossible to predict where it's going to go.
Okay. Well, it's interesting that you say that there is strategic vulnerability between the two, because from what I've read, many authors argue that the fact that the US has ballistic missile defense systems around China is a major concern for China, for the survivability of their arsenal. And so I was about to ask if the US actually still needs ballistic missile defense, both on its homeland and on the territory of its allies, namely the Republic of Korea and Japan. But at this point, I'm actually I'm flipping the question whether are they really useful, since there is already strategic vulnerability between the two?
Well, so far the missile defense capabilities of the United States have not been sized or equipped to affect the strategic capabilities of China. That was an explicit program back in the 1970s. That was an explicit intention. In this round, the focus has been on North Korea and Iran, of course, the states known as rogue states in the past. But with China, it's different, not least because at least the current U.S. missile defense system does not appear to seek to keep up with the pace of the Chinese nuclear development. You would have to have a lot more launchers if you wanted to intercept this. And also because the Chinese are not standing still. I mean, they've been doing their upgrades explicit to overcome whatever effect there might be from a missile defense system. The missile defense system could not, in any conceivable scenario, take out the entire Chinese long-range arsenal. It just doesn't work that way. If anyone has a concern, one could sort of say, well, suppose there was an American first strike on Chinese nuclear forces, then they knock out, 80% of them. Would the 20% that's left then be affected by the missile defense system? So that's the kind of argument that people talk about. But it has influenced their development from day one. I mean, when President Bush pulled out of the ABM treaty, the Chinese explicitly stated their concern about, if the U.S. moves ahead with this and builds capabilities, they would have to take, their countermeasures. And they did, first by increasing the number of missiles, and then secondly by putting multiple warheads on them. And now you see the new systems that are coming in, they have multiple warhead capability. It's not just a small fraction of the force as today. The future force will be more MIRVed than it is today, and can be MIRVed more if they needed to. So for all these reasons, I think missile defense is important, and it's an important factor to influence how China has been thinking about this and what it has done on the ground. But it's not the only even primary driver of China's modernization. I think it's increasing with forces. I think the fear of a first strike against its forces, that the United States could take them out, is probably more important to them, as well as national prestige, of course. But I also just want to remind people that when you talk about risk to Chinese forces, it's not just risk from nuclear attacks. It's also, and very importantly so, conventional attack capabilities that the United States have vastly increased over the last several decades. And there is both kinetic as well as non-kinetic cyber attacks that could be brought to bear. So one has to be careful about comparing nuclear forces and drawing sort of big strategic conclusions from that, because there are other factors that are influencing the strategic thinking as well that are very important.
I understand. So you talked about treaties such as the ABM, and so I want to tie in and ask you a question about the tied to the disarmament commitment of the NPT signatories. So since both China and the US are signatories to the treaty, I wanted to ask you, is arms control with the PRC feasible? Because China has always been quite touchy about the arsenal. So considering it's a small arsenal, of course, quantitative arms control is really hard to imagine with China. But maybe qualitative arms control, or maybe it's going back to quantitative, but I was thinking setting a ceiling for China and an objective in disarmament for the US. So in that sense, China would gain relative weight over the US with their nuclear forces. And so my question would be, is there a reason why China doesn't engage at all in arms control?
Well, historically, China has rejected arms control with the United States and Russia um, by arguing that once you guys come down to our level, then we'll talk. That has sort of been the excuse in the past, and they're still using that argument. But they're also, and they're definitely pushing that the United States and Russia have a particular responsibility when it comes to reducing nuclear force levels, because they have so many more than any other nuclear armed state, including China. Once China is done, if there is ever such a point, but once it's implemented by 2030 or so, the modernization program it is currently working on, they would have by U.S. intelligence claims, they would have something in the order of 700 to 1,000 nuclear weapons. Some even think more, but we'll see where they go. But and that is a tripling, almost quadrupling of their current arsenal. And so that in and of itself, of course, says that the Chinese must realize that they're sort of moving in a direction where they will have to, at some point, think more about other arguments for why they won't involve in arms control, because they can't keep using this. We have a minimum deterrent if they, triple or quadruple the number of weapons, and when you come down to our level, well, if they're climbing closer to their level, then those arguments become less powerful, of course, effective. But so all arms control only depend on the political will. And so, if there is a political will that a country sees certain benefits that it wants to achieve from arms control, then it'll be interesting. And so for China, the issue is not, will it submit to US demands that it should, international pressure that it should do this. That's not the issue. The issue is whether can people come up with an articulation of security results, improved security results that come from Chinese participation in arms control. That would be in the Chinese interest. If that's the case, then I think the Chinese are much easier to talk with about these issues. But that's a long way away, and we'll see where they go. But I think it is possible to get to a conversation about this. But I also think that conversation has to start and can start right now about not necessarily talking about nuclear arms limits, but talking about managing the security situation, managing incidents, dangerous situations in operations, crisis, confidence building measures, things like that are softer, perhaps easier politically to go about, and where both sides quite clearly can see their benefits here now. So that's perhaps another way, to step up through the list of arms control initiatives gradually, and then gradually build up toward actual numerical limitations.
I understand. So this would kind of fall in line with the idea of Cunningham, so that in order to reach sit on the table with the Chinese, the US would have to combine non-nuclear issues to nuclear issues on the security perspective, right? So I want to ask, what are some examples of these non-nuclear issues that can be tied to nuclear ones?
Yeah. Well, the ones that come to mind most immediately, of course, are conventional strike capabilities. This is actually an interesting area where both the United States, but also China, have made significant enhancements in the previous few decades. On the U.S. side, we had for many decades had the Tomahawk cruise missile that has significant strategic capability. They can be effective against mobile launchers, depending on updating of guidance, targeting guidance. We have a new system that has come in over the last about 5 years or so, and is building up significantly, which is the JASSM, the long-range conventional air-launched cruise missile. That system is being enhanced, and there are others in the pipeline. We're also seeing the U.S. as a result of pulling out of the INF treaty with Russia, developing medium and intermediate range conventional forces, including ballistic missiles. They're still some way away from deployment, but that's a development that has been happening on the US side, of course. On the Chinese side, we've seen this very dramatic development of them developing sort of and deploying a parallel, if you will, a parallel regional strategic force, where medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles with long range have conventional capability. And they've done that explicitly because they want to have regional options below the nuclear thresholds. So suddenly you have a situation where not only the United States has had this for years, but also improving it, but also the Chinese have considerable conventional strike capabilities for regional scenarios out there. So that's potentially an area where you could imagine real talks, real discussions about, force levels, deployment areas, behavior, all this kind of stuff. And so that's sort of a halfway step, perhaps, to the larger issue of nuclear forces. Yeah.
So, talking about, since we have a little time and we've talked about the regional options of the PRC and way to reach an agreement between the two actors, I was curious also about the situation with Taiwan, because I remember last year China has engaged in its ritual saber rattling with the tiny islands. So there's always the goal of national unification, even though that's already a bit complicated. But the question I wanted to ask, and really the thing that made me choose this topic for the podcast was, would you think, I know it's a tricky question, but would you think that the Chinese nuclear arsenal in some way emboldens China to and encourages this aggressive behavior towards the island? Because I would think that had China not had a nuclear arsenal, would be more wary of threatening what is substantially a US ally in the Pacific.
Yes, that is the theory going around, or hypothesis going around among Western analysts, some Western analysts, when it comes to trying to explain the relationship with the Chinese conventional forces and their near interests, territorial interests, and then the development of the nuclear forces. That somehow the better nuclear forces would sort of create this umbrella underneath which the Chinese could be emboldened, could be more adventurous about what it's doing. It's in periphery, and of course that is a valid hypothesis. The question, though, is both in terms of China, but also in terms of the United States. What are the regional interests in which they would be willing to go nuclear? The point being that once you go nuclear, it may not stay regional. You very quickly get to a level where the two sides may not back down, and therefore have to escalate to the strategic level. So it's not as clear cut as I think people normally make it. There are the Taiwan issue is, of course, center to the Chinese leadership's sort of idea about what should happen in its near region, but it's also central to, according to China readers, central to the Chinese leadership's perception of its own survivability internally, domestically, that if it lost a war over Taiwan, it would lose all domestic legitimacy, of course. So there are all those factors as well that play out and could make perhaps the Chinese leadership react more dramatically to a loss of a military campaign against Taiwan. At the same time, even the Chinese leadership would, of course, have to consider, if they did go nuclear over Taiwan, what would be the next step?
Okay, so you would say that at least the PRC would be at least cautious about going nuclear over the goal of national integrity, given the risks it entails.
Yeah, I mean, this is an old dilemma that we've had in discussions about the relationship between conventional and nuclear in regional scenarios. I mean, this was a very prominent issue of discussion during the Cold War when NATO had insufficient nuclear forces in Europe to counter a Soviet conventional attack, and therefore relied more on nuclear to counter that. And so, but at the time, the issue was always, would you sacrifice, Washington over Berlin or something like that? How important, how far would we go? And so for Taiwan, the issue is, for the United States, the US nuclear strike plans don't end with a limited scenario over Taiwan. They can go all the way up. And Chinese planners presumably know that. But the question is, how far would the United States be willing to go in risking attack against its cities in a clash over Taiwan? I mean, how important is Taiwan to the United States national security? That plays out as well. So there are dilemmas in both camps about how you think through this. And so it's not as linear as I think people normally imagine. These are very complicated and are really important reminders about why it is so dangerous to be sort of casual about regional conflicts, that it is out of the regional conflicts that escalation to nuclear, first tactical or regional, and eventually strategic, can come. So one has to be extraordinarily careful about not being too sort of willing and trigger happy about important regional scenarios.
Okay, so thank you for the answer. And now I will move on to the summing up questions. And so the first question would be whether the current developments in the Chinese nuclear arsenal are an actual threat, or just China trying to evening out the playing field, bargaining cheap, or something like that.
Well, the threat comes from two ways of thinking about it. One, the threat is about willingness to use and intentions, not just military capabilities.
Well, of course.
But of course, if you're in the city in the United States, then the threat is also what could hit you. So it's a mix, of course. But it's very hard to sort of to quantify a threat. But if it comes to a willingness to use and how you could use and what the damage that use could inflict, then I think it is stepping up toward a more dangerous situation. I think the willingness to use could come, not that the Chinese leadership would suddenly, reach out and just strike out of the blue or something like that.
Yes, of course.
They're fully aware of the consequences, but more that they become more confident that they can, do things they otherwise couldn't do to threaten in their regional near areas. So that can certainly have an influence. The other one is about once you modernize your forces, and certainly once you increase, but once you modernize the forces that you're also increasing, you get new military capabilities. With that come new ways to potentially use those forces, more flexibility, more tailored forms of attack, perhaps entertaining a more gradual stepping up escalation strategy. The Chinese strategy has in the past been, nuclear strategy has in the past been seen as relatively sort of simple, that you enter a crisis, it turns hot, there's a conventional war, China is losing, its forces are put on alert. If someone either knocks out or seeks to knock out China as a state, or attacks it with nuclear weapons, then the Chinese forces would be able to retaliate and hopefully deter that country from ever again doing that. So sort of now the thinking is that the Chinese are considering a number of smaller steps before getting to that sort of big bang. And those involve capabilities that they have developed, both medium-range missiles that they've had for a long time. So medium-range nuclear missiles is not a new thing in Chinese thinking. So they've had those scenarios against regional targets, primarily U.S. military facilities in the region. But now us intermediate-range missiles that are dual capable, both nuclear and conventional, and are more accurate, much more accurate. So there are a number of nuclear capabilities that come with that modernization that give them options potentially. So it'll be very interesting to see how that influences their military thinking, the way they talk about what the role of their nuclear force is supposed to play. And then, of course, at the final level, the damage they can inflict against an adversary. And that goes without saying, of course, that if you triples or quadruple your strategic long-range forces, then then you can inflict enormously more damage on an adversary, and that's perhaps intended to get their attention. So for all these reasons, yes, it looks more threatening, but I don't think it's like we're just gonna flare up and strike you tomorrow out of the blue nuclear attack. I don't think that's the kind of risk we have to fear.
Okay, and is according to you, is there something that concrete that the US can do to cool down strategic relations with China?
There are a number of issues. It's difficult, of course, if in the United States, the way it is being seen is that China is the one doing all the bad things.
Yes.
And therefore, how could we not at least meet them part of the way? And so here I think it's important that this is an issue that's really relevant right now, and a question that's really relevant now, because of course, the Biden administration is now in the final phase of a nuclear posture review, where it's examining the role that US nuclear weapons should play, and what its policy for use of them, declaratory policy, for example, how it speaks about what the role is, how it's going to modernize its forces, does it need more things, whatever. So that review is expected to largely continue the very large scale comprehensive nuclear modernization program put in place by the Obama administration, or started by the Obama administration and continued by the Trump administration. The real issue is it going to continue sort of the nuclear supplements, as they were called, additional nuclear capabilities that the Trump administration was trying to get into the US posture. Or will it say, we have enough. We can accomplish our strategic objectives with the nuclear force we have. We don't need to increase as well.
Mm.
And I think it's very telling that militarily, the way the United States has responded, not only to Russia, but also to China, has been almost entirely in conventional capabilities. If you look at, for example, the kind of weapons that are being developed in response to the pulling out of the INF Treaty, they're not nuclear, they're conventional. The military sees a use for those weapon systems, not a necessity to have more nuclear strike platforms. But again, we don't know the results of the nuclear posture review. So I think one thing the United States could do is not to overreact.
Okay.
Sounds simplistic, but the worst thing I think would be to fuel the arms race flame, but be cool, calm, and collect about reminding adversaries of the extraordinary capabilities that we have already in our nuclear arsenal. And not to forget the growing conventional strike capabilities that we also have. So those are issues. I just want to pick up on that last bit there about the growing conventional, because one has to be careful here. It's not just because we do something that is not nuclear, therefore it's great.
Yes.
Conventional forces can do two things. When they become very effective and are seen by an adversary in becoming very effective, they can actually contribute to that adversary's sense of why it needs nuclear weapons and more of them. We've seen this in Russia's case with its heavy reliance on tactical nuclear weapons. There were nuclear weapons in general, for that matter, but certainly tactical nuclear weapons seen as a way to overcome US superiority in conventional capabilities. Russia has improved its conventional systems in recent years, but that is still a factor that is driving their thinking on that matter. For the Chinese, absolutely concerned about conventional strike capabilities. Many of the road mobile systems that are in the regional areas of China can be held at risk with conventional strike capabilities. So this is an important factor also for regulating the military competition and the temperature of the potential strike scenarios that both countries, of course, are planning. So there are a number of issues that could be worked on. But again, I think the important part is not to overreact and increase that Cold War-like dynamic that we're very much seeing an uptick in these years. So that's, I think, my primary recommendation.
Okay, so I think that is going to be it for today. Thank you again for coming to our podcast, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Sounds good. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.